In this video demonstration, I will be producing a self-portrait from life. However, I will use this photographic reference from time to time to kind of help illustrate a few concepts. First thing that I'm doing is I'm putting in a middle value, diluting it a lot with solvent, and then I'm going to kind of wipe away some of the excess solvent with this rag. The first thing that I want to do is kind of get my main measurement down onto my panel. So I'm establishing the height of the head by identifying the top of the cranium as well as the bottom of the chin, and then between that region I'm subdividing it into fourths. I'm kind of getting a very loose drawing down, and that's fine. Since I'm going to shift around quite a bit, since I'm working off of myself, I can't necessarily be so exact with establishing the linear drawing. I find it a little bit easier in this instance for me to just start putting down paint. Now, if I'm working from a photo exclusively and things are static, well, this would be a different story. I would probably spend a little bit more time working on the drawing, either with pencil or with paint. Now, the first areas that I established was the shadow shapes. After I established the shadow shapes, I went for kind of the other major landmarks. At least for me, this works to my advantage, my facial hair. So these were some of the darkest value accents in the entire portrait, so I laid those in fairly loosely and with a decent amount of solvent. All of this is fairly loose. If I make a mistake, no biggie. I can go back in and I can make corrections. I can wipe it away. And so I'm getting incrementally more specific with the painting process. Now, I think I have the majority of the major landmarks kind of in place. I'm putting additional solvent on a brush to kind of go in and maybe carve some areas out, make things a little bit lighter in some areas, just to kind of refine the drawing before I start going in with color. And so you can see right here, I'm actually kind of wiping away some of that initial tone with solvent on this brush. And I'm also going in and kind of refining the ringer on the shirt, as well as going into the background and kind of carving out the contour of my silhouette just so that the drawing is a little bit more accurate. Once I can get this more or less down and I'm fairly confident with it, then I can start going in with more opaque color and kind of filling in the gaps. But you can see already at this stage, we have not necessarily a likeness by any means, but at least we have a general structure. Once again, it should be loose at this stage. We can always refine it the further we get into the painting process. One thing that I should mention, my palette, when I'm working on specifically Caucasian flesh, I go for yellow ochre. It's a lot less saturated, but starting from something that's already a little bit more neutralized actually helps us out because it saves us time from having to mix everything down considerably. Now, the first areas that I established were the shadow shapes. This is a pretty difficult color to identify. What I would recommend is try to map out where it lies on the value scale. It's in kind of the darker region, but it's not completely black. And we can probably get a sense of its overall temperature. Is it warmer or is it cooler? And that's probably going to be your best guide for being able to mix that color. In this case, it's kind of like a warm brown more than anything that has a little bit of a greenish quality. After I get that kind of blocked in there, then I'm starting to go in and build up the light regions. And we can already see that it's not a likeness yet by any means, but we're starting to get some of that information in there. One of the things that I've stressed fairly consistently in this class is do not judge your work too soon. Because if I stepped back and looked at this particular painting, I would be a horrid mess, because I'd be like, this doesn't look anything like me. But I know that by going through this process and trusting myself, I can get it to where I want it to be with time. Admittedly, the final result of this painting is not perfect by any means, but I only spent roughly about 2 hours on it. And so now I'm going through and I'm building up the light areas. And, I'm constantly readjusting, trying to correct the drawing, because once again, I established it fairly loosely. So I knew that throughout the duration of this process, I was going to be constantly reassessing, painting over other areas, taking back other areas, and kind of modeling the form. This is just one approach. If I had established a really solid drawing in the very beginning, that would have worked as well. But there might be a disadvantage of going about it in that sort of manner. What might happen is more like a coloring book quality, where you're just trying to paint within the lines. So it's more or less a matter of what works best for you and your process. So I'm going through and it's starting to come together. As you can see, that my eyes are essentially just dark accents. I haven't really dealt with anything there yet, but I put in those dark value accents early on, and it was pretty diluted with solvent. Therefore, it's easy for me to kind of go back in and paint on top of it and make corrections. But I know with both the eyelids as well as the pupils, that having those dark value regions in thinly is actually going to give me a little bit more flexibility to kind of go in and add in the white of the eyes without having to fight or wrestle with the paint. It's just one thing that I've kind of gleaned over the years of doing portraits. And to be 100% truthful, portraiture as well as the figure is not my main focus. So this is what I've gleaned. I've done a lot over the years, but I'm nowhere near a lot of the other artists that I've kind of showed you this semester that focus exclusively on portraiture. One thing that I'm always constantly looking at when I'm doing this portrait and refining it is I'm thinking consciously about planes. We talked about planar analysis. That is, if you watch the PowerPoint that I have on Canvas, planes are a way for us to kind of anticipate value changes as well as either temperature shift or huge changes. And so I'm looking for that consciously from my reference, or in this case, from life. In addition, you'll see a lot of times that the marks will kind of follow the direction of that plane. This is something that's fairly evident with Alla prima portraiture, because it has to be done in one session. That because it's done relatively quickly, there's not that much blending involved, and so you're going to see this simplification of the head kind of being defined by those planes. So I went in there, I added in the whites of the eyes, and it kind of looks like I have eyeliner at the moment because I painted on top of that dark value shape that I had initially established early on in the painting. And I'll go back in and correct it. I'm kind of leaving some information undefined, in part because I know I'm going to go back in and add in the glasses later on. And so I'm not getting a complete picture because that element, which is influencing a lot of the value shapes and colors that I'm perceiving, hasn't been integrated into the painting quite yet. And so I'm just kind of going in here. You saw that I kind of painted a little bit more information for the hat. And I'm starting to kind of clarify the region around my eyes. I'm doing this by putting in the last piece to the puzzle. Once this element is in here, then I can have a more fully realized representation of what I'm seeing. And now I can start to really focus on the refinement stage of the painting. Honestly, once I can get to this point in the painting process, I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but a lot of the hard work has already been done. Now it's about just kind of adding more paint and maybe taking stuff away and pushing and pulling the material to kind of get the image to where it needs to be. The structure is probably the hardest part of this particular process, and being able to identify those larger color relationships. Once you can get those down, then the rest becomes a little bit easier. At least that's my experience. Because this way you can start just focusing on specific areas. It becomes a little bit more about the minutia. And I don't think people are going to be quite as critical about that. This is not to say that subtlety can't hurt your painting if it's incorrectly placed. So it's a delicate balance, but I will say that I think the general establishment of the color relationships and the drawing, getting the big picture down, is probably the hardest part. Because I feel like, in truth, I could probably have left this painting at this stage of the process and been relatively happy. I think it communicated what it really needed to say. But I wanted to push it a little bit further, so that's what I continued to do. And so now I'm kind of going in. You can see that I'm kind of bringing up some of the reflected light, kind of to emphasize the back edge of my jaw. And I'm just kind of pushing the values a little bit more. You know, this is somewhat experimenting. I'm going in and I'm pushing some values a little bit darker, especially in the shadow shapes, kind of right underneath my chin. I noticed that it's a little bit darker, and then as it kind of moves around the neck and around the jaw, it's getting more reflected light, and so it's going to be lighter in value. And if it doesn't work out with it, I can lighten it back up. Since I'm working wet into wet, it's not that difficult for me to make these changes. Once again, it's about learning how to adapt with the materials. It might not necessarily go according to plan if you try this at the moment, but have confidence in essentially if you make a mistake, you can correct it. I think that's really important for you to know that. So now I'm going in, I'm kind of adding in my ear, and now I'm kind of refining the patch on the hat. I'm kind of dancing around a lot, and you can see that within the painting. One thing that I noticed watching back at this video, I definitely look more like a fly in terms of my movements in the background, just due to the constant twitching back and forth of looking at the painting as well as looking at the mirror. So it's really important to also consider the background. Once I can get some of those color relationships down, I'm going to probably paint over portions of my hat and kind of consistently refine that drawing, because I kind of established that region a little loosely. I think maybe I made the hat a little too big in general in the particular painting, but you know, that might be something that I could correct on a second session if I felt that it was worth pursuing. Now, I should mention that this painting is not very large. It's only a 6x8. I'm painting on panel, and I'm using predominantly synthetic brushes. Actually, I think it's some of the brushes that I've mentioned throughout the school year. I think this is one of the Princeton round brushes, and I'm kind of bracing my arm either with my pinky or with my other arm in order to kind of get in there and get a little bit more control for adding in some of the highlights, I think specifically on the eyes. And so I'm just going in and putting a dab here or there and stepping back and kind of evaluating the painting. That's extremely important for you to do. And once again, the palette that I'm using is ultramarine blue, cad red, yellow ochre, and titanium white. I did not use any other pigment during the creation of this particular painting. Granted, because of my skin color as well as my environment, it's all fairly neutral. I felt like I could get away with using these pigments. The only area that, kind of upon reflection, that I think could use a little bit more color is the patch on my hat. Specifically, there is kind of a vibrant yellow in the sun, and probably a cobalt blue would have been beneficial as well. But in order to keep the painting more or less harmonious, I just kind of refrained. It wasn't necessary for me to hit those exact color notes. As I mentioned many times before this semester, color relationships are more important than exactitudes. What I mean by that is you don't have to mix the exact color you're perceiving. In some instances, your pigments won't be able to actually match that. However, if you can get those relationships down, such as the shadow mass or the form shadow being pretty much the right relationship with the light side of the form, that's kind of what you need to focus your attention on. So we're kind of finishing up this particular portrait, and I'm just kind of going in here and adding a little bit more information for the background, so that way I can maybe carve out kind of the back of my head just a little bit in terms of refining that contour or that silhouette of that shape. And I'm paying attention to my shoulders because they're not really defined, so I have to kind of add in the rest of my shirt as well as paint in the background. I have to kind of assess both of those elements at the same time in order to kind of get the rounding of the form kind of where I want it to be. And now I'm just putting in a few other accents here and there so that the place that I'm in feels a little bit more resolved, and I'm kind of just consistently assessing my values, my color relationships, so the portrait seems kind of where it needs to be.